Hey everyone, so this week in our Sewing for Beginners course, we're going to talk about the essential equipment you need to get started in sewing. So lots of you will probably have looked at projects and patterns and things you want, but there are a few bits of kit that are essential if you're going to start sewing. There's so many different gadgets and gizmos out there that I know it's confusing when you're a beginner to know what you actually need. So we're going to talk through some of the most useful bits and bobs that you will definitely need, and then a couple of other handy items for beginners that I would say are really worth having as well. So let's take a look at what we've got.
So first up, obviously you're going to need some pins. So there's loads of different types of pins. Most of the time it depends on personal preference really as to what sort of pins you prefer. So you can get dressmakers pins, which have really small fine heads on them, so they don't mark too badly, but they are harder to pick up. Then you can get things like button head and flower head pins, which are great for marking because obviously you can see the heads of them really easily. However, they tend to have plastic heads, so if you're going to iron over them pins, they'll melt. So if you want to do ironing with your pins in, then I'd recommend glass head pins, which are both easy to see and pull out, and you can iron over them. And these come in like a regular length, and you can also get extra long ones as well. Now you're going to need pins whatever you do, so it's worth investing in even a couple of different types to see what you like best. After pins, of course, you're going to need needles. So it's always good to have at least a set of kind of general household needles to hand, because you'll probably need some to finish off certain things like buttons, or just to hand sew something for a finer finish. If you've got a machine and you're going to machine sew, you will also need some machine needles. Most of the time when you buy a machine it does come with some, but if it doesn't, or if you want to get some, universal needles are the best place to start with. So if you're not sewing stretch fabrics, you'll be using universal most of the time. Either get a mixed pack of light, so you'll tend to use a 70 or 80 for a lot of fabrics as a beginner, or a medium 80, 12s are also good. For your machine, it will also most likely come with bobbins, but if you need some extras, often it only comes with say 3, and you'll probably want one for all of the major colours you use, so you don't have to keep unwinding them. You can get bobbins for the make of your machine, so normally they'll state the make and sometimes the model if they have different sizes. The main difference between them is this width, so where it says 10mm, that is the difference in the height of the bobbin. And some machines are really fussy, they only like either the particular brand or a particular size, so it may be worth having a little Google of your machine and seeing. You can also get these filled boxes which have tons in them, which are really useful if your machine takes them. These are standard size ones. Other than bobbins, another key essential is a seam ripper. So these are much of a muchness as to what you get. You can get tiny ones that are quite cheap, but they don't tend to last very long. They're easy to break and hard to find. So I'd recommend a fairly sturdy one that's going to see you a while. I quite like this Prim ergonomic one because it's got this nice little place for your thumb to rest and a little cap at the bottom. Some people also like these Seam Fix ones, which has a silicone end, so you can rub it against the threads that you've broken and they come out nice and easily. It really depends how much you want to spend, but obviously the bigger ones are a bit sturdier and easier to find. You'll also definitely need a tape measure, so get a flexible tape measure wherever you can find one. You can get ones like this that are coloured, you can get extra long ones. I'd also recommend a needle threader, so this one's a little hummingbird one that you can use to thread your hand needles, which is just helpful because when you're tired or in the evenings it's just annoying not being able to thread. Scissors are another really important part, so you'll need a decent pair of scissors, and I would recommend getting at least one bigger pair to cut your fabrics. So you can choose any size or type. Most people will go for something above 20cm, which is the blade length, so measured from here to here, because that gives you a nice surface area for cutting long bits of fabric. Brand wise, it's really up to you how much you want to spend. In my opinion, Fiskars are the best brand. They stay sharp the longest, they're worth the investment. They are a little bit more expensive, but they'll last you a long time, and often don't need sharpening very often if you look after them well. They come in all different sizes and types. The most popular ones we have are the 21cm orange pair, or the heavy duty Amplify ones. These are the ones that we use all the time for cutting our fabrics. They're really good and have a nice weight to them, and they have stayed sharp for about 6 years. We've never had to sharpen them, which is amazing. We cut every day. Otherwise, if you want a cheaper pair, you can get ones like these that tend to be about 10 quid, but you may end up having to buy a few pairs because they do go blunt quite quickly. So it really depends how much you want to spend. You'll also be worth having either a little pair of embroidery scissors with a nice fine point like this for snipping off your threads, or you can get something called thread snips, which are these. So these have like a spring action, and you pinch them together and it has a little blade there, so they're great for just trimming the ends of your threads once you finish sewing. If you're going to go into dressmaking or quilting, but particularly dressmaking, marking tools are quite important. So having some nice fabric markers that are useful. You can get ones like these that are a bit like chalk but in a pencil version, which are easier to use. You can get your classic tailor's chalk, so it's just like a square of chalk. You can also get things like vanishing markers, which are good, but they don't necessarily last that long. So if you're going to leave it for a long time, say a couple of days, go for something chalk based because the marks will stay. If you're dressmaking, then something like tracing paper is also really good for tracing out your patterns, so you don't have to cut one size and lose all the other sizes. So you can trace it out onto tracing paper. You can either get plain or squared. That's quite useful. And then a couple of other bits that are also handy but you don't need them are a sewing gauge. So these I find really good for a beginner, particularly if you're measuring hems and seam allowances. You literally just slide this little plastic bit down to the seam allowance you've got on the ruler, and then you can measure it really accurately all the way along. It's so easy, and it means you get a really nice finish. They're not very expensive, they're a couple of quid, and just really helpful. The other thing is a set of threads. Obviously you're going to need threads. Normally you would buy them to match the colour of the fabric that you're using. Sometimes it's helpful to just pick up a set that has quite a few colours, because you'll find you'll keep going back to the same colours again and again and again. Often black, white, grey, pinks and blues get used a lot. So these are a great way of building up your colour stash. The thread sets, like these Gutermann ones where they sell them in a set amount, are usually a cheaper way of getting wider range of colours than having to buy them individually. So they do sets of 10 or 20, so it really depends how much sewing you think you're going to do, but they are worth the money in my opinion to build up your colour range. So you've got like basic sets and then brights and pastels. And then one other thing that most beginners we found helpful are these magnetic seam guides. So they just help you sew in a straight line when you're first starting to sew. You can see in the little diagram here, they're magnetic, so they don't recommend them for digital machines because of the magnets and computers. But basically they'll sit onto the metal plate of your machine, and you line it up to the seam allowance that you've got. So say it's 2 centimetres, you'll line it up against that line here, and then you can sew and just sew with butting your fabric up against the edge of it. So it just helps you keep a straight line without having to always look for the little groove on your machine. Again, they're only a couple of quid, but they're just one of those things that makes life a lot easier when you're starting to sew. And they come in a few different designs.
So those are the basic sort of equipments. Of course, you'll need a sewing machine as well for most types of sewing. You can do hand sewing for some projects, but on the whole you'll want a sewing machine. That's another topic entirely. You can check out the blog for more advice on picking a sewing machine. But yeah, let us know in the comments if you've got any other suggestions for equipment that is essential for a beginner or just really useful.